Welcome back to the conversation. I am joined now by top Democratic strategist Crystal Knight, who is an advocate for DC statehood. Crystal, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So I think most of the people, it's great to have you here. So I think most of the people that are going to be watching this are probably already in agreement that DC ought to be made a state. They vaguely understand that this is a ridiculous colonial practice. What is going on? Let's just hurry up and do this. So let's get into some of the details about what it's going to take to actually make it happen, and what the actual kind of day-to-day consequences are for district residents. And you made an interesting point recently that when the COVID relief package was implemented, that the district suffered for its lack of statehood. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So just before we get into the COVID relief package, I want to just say at the outset that the approval for DC statehood has 54% nationwide approval. So Americans across the country already agree that DC residents, which makes up 71,000 residents, we should have statehood. And so knowing that it has a national approval rating is very, very helpful when we're thinking about HR 1 being passed. As it relates to COVID, because we are not a state, we don't receive the same benefits that regular states or traditional states may get. So that may mean funding, that may mean things like vaccines. If you've seen the latest numbers, DC is not doing well with COVID vaccinations. And so the question may be, well, why is that? If this is the nation's capital, many of our elected officials come in throughout here week in and week out. Why are we doing so poorly with COVID vaccinations? Well, states have priority in receiving vaccinations because they have jurisdiction over their affairs. DC still has to run many of our laws, many of the things that we do through the federal government. And so that's one of the small nuances why we should have our own elected body that we can govern over it, and we don't have to call on Big Brother or the federal government, if you will.
And so let's talk about a couple of the constitutional obstacles that are thrown up by opponents in front of it. First of all, people say, well, look, the Constitution says that DC has to be 10 by 10. Okay, yes, Virginia was allowed to leave, but that was never actually challenged in the Supreme Court. And perhaps if it had been, the Supreme Court would have said, well, you can't do that. Take that piece of Northern Virginia and stick it back in Washington, D.C. Why doesn't that fly?
Well, it doesn't fly because Maryland has already given the city land, and Marylanders have already stated they voted in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, that they did not want any land in DC to go back into their state. So because we've already been given land has already been willed, if you will, into the city, that argument doesn't fly. We've seen land be redistributed and given back into the city. And so that's just an argument that people who are against statehood are making, but it really won't hold up to water.
No, that's right, and the Constitution also says that the district can't be more than 10 miles square. It doesn't say it can't be less, and to the point of it being less, of several years ago, the District of Columbia was given electoral college votes in the presidential election, and so what opponents of statehood say now is that, well, that wouldn't be fair because now DC would have double the number of electoral college votes because its 3 electors are right now in the Constitution and they would remain in the Constitution. So what do you do about that situation?
Well, really what the opponents of DC statehood are really saying is they don't want more Democratic electors. They don't want more Democratic votes. So I think we should really name a thing a thing. And so there's some, tricky language around the electors, what's already established here in the district. But really this fight is about adding more Democratic votes to Congress, adding more Democratic votes to the Senate. And that's ultimately when I hear the language like that, we don't want to add more, there's already things that exist. It's really around a political fight, a party line. And I think that we should just be honest in the conversation and say that.
Okay, so Crystal, walk me through what this would look like. My understanding is that there would still be a district, but the lines would go around with the White House, Congress, maybe the Supreme Court, or a couple federal buildings. And then the rest of it would be the state of DC or state of Columbia. Is that more or less what people are thinking? Because there would still be a tiny sliver of a district, right?
That is correct. So basically, once statehood happens, the Capitol and the land immediately around the Capitol and the White House will remain federal land. And then the state would be actually, I think the proposed name right now is Washington Douglas State. So again, that's a proposal, pending everything being passed. And it would not exceed 10 miles in radius, is my understanding. And so you're right that there would be a slither of a carve out literally from the Capitol down to the White House. So the National Mall, the monuments that are lining the mall would still remain federal land.
And so how do they, how I'm just trying to think through this. How would they deal with the fact that technically, according to the Constitution, the Capitol and that tiny sliver would still have 3 electoral college votes? It's like if Trump were in the White House and he were the only resident, like he and his family, could vote in Washington D.C. and win Washington D.C. and get 3 electoral college votes out of it. Is that just something that the country would be stuck with until they amended the Constitution? And maybe once you make it a state, then people are like, all right, fine, it's a state. Let's amend the Constitution and fix this.
Right. I think that's the thinking. I think so. There's a organization that's been established to really look at what statehood might look like in the city and how it will function. What are all of the offices that will be added? What are things that will be removed? And then for the federal land that's still, that slither that we've been discussing, there will be some conversation around the 23rd Amendment, if and when and how that might shape out, pending the House and the Senate voting on it. And so I don't think that that's a question that I can answer with, very specific, certainty. But what I can say is there are people who are actively studying this. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton suggested that statehood, be enacted over 30 years ago. And so I would hope that they have 30 years worth of planning and can figure out what this process might look like as we move forward.
Yeah, you would definitely hope. If it does happen, they abolish the filibuster, they move this through. How quickly does this go into effect? Do I wake up one morning in the District of Columbia and then the next day it's a state? When do senators get sworn in? When do we have a governor? When do we have a member of a voting member of Congress?
Yeah, so what the legislation has proposed is a transition committee, giving the mayor of the District of Columbia right now, who's Muriel E. Bowser, jurisdiction to appoint sitting congresspeople, to appoint senators. And if I'm not mistaken, a vote would have to be taken by the over 700,000 residents here in the District of Columbia. So the short answer is we would not wake up and the next day we have all the functionality as a state. There will be a transition committee that would literally phase in processes as proposed by the legislation. And then at some point, that information would be relayed to the District of Columbia residents. And then we would begin the process of building a government, building a new state-based government.
Right, and I expect, and I'm curious, I bet the referendum would get Saddam Hussein level support. When he used to run for president, remember he would get 98% or something if he would run for president. I would think DC statehood would have over 90% support in a city referendum. What's your read on if the rubber really hit the road on statehood? How many residents would vote for it?
Well, right now it enjoys 86% approval rating. That's really, really high. I think DC residents are tired of being taxed at a higher rate than 22 states in this nation. As a District of Columbia resident, I pay more federal taxes than 22 other states. We are larger than the state of Wyoming. We've seen states like the Dakotas before there was a South Dakota and a North Dakota. It was just a Dakota. We've seen them split. And so we're saying, when is our turn to become a state? When is it our turn to have true representation in Congress? When is it our turn that our congressperson, Eleanor Holmes Norton, gets a vote? And so I don't think that you'll find too many district residents who are in disagreement that we should become a state.
Right, and the argument that that it's all political and that Democrats just won a couple of senators is irrelevant to the question of the justice of the situation, but B, every state, more or less, that was admitted over the last 150 years was admitted as part of some political process. You mentioned the Dakotas; they were split up so that Republicans could squeeze 4 senators out of that chunk of land out there, rather than just 2 senators. We have to go pretty quickly, but as a DC resident, I did want to get your take while I've got you here on the fencing around the Capitol. Eleanor Holmes Norton, as you know, has been pushing to have this come down. She's been pushing no funding for a permanent fence. What's your take on what ought to be done about the fence around the Capitol?
Well, I think that that's a great question. I think post the January 6th insurrection, I have been a resident who said I would like the fencing to come down because it feels like we are a city in bondage. We are a city under military surveillance and in war. And that's just not how people should live. But I think considering what happened this past Friday with the young man who ran through security protocols, I believe that the Capitol Police need to reassess what is truly needed. They need to do more with recruiting. They need to do more with understanding how people can become a threat and really iron out what their protocol measures will be moving forward.
Well, Crystal Knight, thank you so much for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'd love to come back.
Anytime.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.